There's an old legend in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions of a kingdom called Shambhala, a realm of peace and purity, inhabited only by the enlightened. Westerners may recognize it better as Shangri-La, after the fictional Tibetan utopia in Lost Horizon, James Hilton's best-selling novel from 1933. Even if you're unfamiliar with the book, or Frank Capra's film inspired by the book, the idea of Shangri-La as a kind of far-flung paradise has been pretty prevalent in modern pop culture ever since. Many Tibetan lamas, or spiritual leaders, have described Shambhala as an inner tantric state.
Shambhala is a Sanskrit word. The meaning is the source of happiness. So that means every single individual need that.
While others have maintained that it has a physical presence on Earth, a promised land hidden in the Himalayas. These exalted paintings are Nicholas Roerich's visions of Shambhala, which the remarkable Russian artist, scholar, mystic, and explorer went to great lengths and icy heights to find. In the 1920s, Roerich and his wife Helena led a mysterious, albeit lion-hearted expedition across 8,000 miles of forbidding terrain. Their purpose was to document the rituals, monuments, and landscapes of Asia's remote reaches, or so they said. The secret motivation behind the pilgrimage was to locate Shambhala. Roerich believed that its discovery would awaken the Buddha of the future, who would guide the world through a purifying apocalypse and into a halcyon age of perfect harmony. Roerich's urge to find truth in folklore made his story as mythic as the legends he chased. The Nicholas Roerich Museum is as wonderfully curious as its namesake. The life and legacy of this eccentric Russian artist who sought to unearth a divine Tibetan kingdom among a dizzying number of other endeavors is preserved in a Manhattan townhouse on the Upper West Side. And most locals whom I've spoken to had no idea that this well-hidden gem exists. A Shambhala of its own right, tucked away on 107th Street. Why the Nicholas Roerich Museum is here has to do with the end of his story, which begins in the Russian city of St. Petersburg in 1874.
Bullshit! Bullshit! Just coming in.
It was an exciting time to come into the world. The Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky completed his masterpiece, the opera Boris Godunov. The Russian author Leo Tolstoy was writing Anna Karenina into existence. The first Impressionist exhibition in Paris fundamentally altered the trajectory of modern art. To be the son of moneyed parents meant exposure to all this greatness, and Roerich grew up surrounded by interesting people and beautiful things. Summers were spent at his family's 4,000-acre country estate, previously owned by a Russian count who had traveled to India. When he returned, he named the estate Ishvara, a Sanskrit term meaning Lord or Supreme Being. Inside the house, a naturally inquisitive Roerich filled his head with accounts of unwavering saints and valiant knights in the library. And in the living room, he'd admire a painting of a sublime Himalayan peak, which he would travel thousands of miles to behold later in life. Outside, ancient woodlands revealed ancestral relics, and he delighted in his own mini archaeological digs. It's interesting that he didn't formally pursue archaeology, but then again, painting was a way for him to imaginatively interpret tales of gods, healers, and talismans. And it's in that nebulous space between history and myth that he was really in his element. He was almost dissuaded from pursuing art as well. It was just assumed that he would go into law as his father did. But like a character in the legends he adored, it was as if destiny had its own plan for Roerich. He struck a deal with his father. He would go to law school if he could also study art in St. Petersburg. It was the 1890s, and the city was buzzing with new notions of modernism. All across Europe, the conventions of academic art were getting the boot in favor of the avant-garde. It was at law school that Roerich crossed paths with Sergei Diaghilev, who had his finger on the pulse. He also had a sensibility for uniting the visual and performing arts, and he would go on to commission some of the most celebrated works of art as the founder of the famous Ballet Russe. Roerich designed fabulous set pieces for various productions, and what I never knew is that he both designed and co-developed the Rite of Spring, which is almost exclusively credited to Igor Stravinsky and considered one of the first and most radical works of modernism. So radical that when the ballet debuted in 1913, it supposedly reduced a glamorous Parisian audience to screaming, heckling, violent animals. Various accounts of its now legendary opening night report objects being catapulted at the dancers on stage, people stripping naked in protest, and at least one official challenge to a duel. Stravinsky was just beside himself as he processed the brutal criticism of what eventually became revered as his magnum opus. Decades later, when Disney produced an animated sequence to the Rite of Spring in Fantasia, the composer brutally denounced the film as a, quote, imbecility. Of course, Fantasia helped make the piece even more iconic. Despite their successful collaboration, Stravinsky saw something suspicious in Roerich. He once said that the artist, quote, looked as though he ought to have been a mystic or a spy. Granted, things had soured between the two men, who bickered over who really deserved top billing for the Rite of Spring, but Stravinsky's read wasn't far off. Together with his wife Helena, Roerich devoured religious doctrines, including those belonging to Theosophy, a kind of proto-New Age movement. Spiritual openness was all the rage at the time, and plenty of artists dabbled in the occult, from Odeon Redon to Pete Mondrian. Add to that the influence of contemporary Russian symbolism, which encouraged investigation of the mystical in Russian literature and art. But the Roerichs were becoming intensely devout. Eventually, he came to believe that he was the reincarnation of the fifth Dalai Lama, so who better to search for Shambhala in earnest and usher in the end of days? In Roerich's defense, political tension in Europe was reaching a fever pitch, and when World War I broke out in 1914, he felt like he had prophetically sensed its arrival. Then came the Russian Revolution in 1917, which ended the Romanov dynasty and marked the beginning of Soviet Russia. The Roerichs had already left for Finland, where Nicholas was recovering from a bout of illness, but little did they know when they left St. Petersburg that the border would close and they would never return. Essentially refugees at this point, the family traveled west to Sweden, then England, then to the US in 1920 with an invitation from the Chicago Art Institute. Roerich painted out west in New Mexico and back east in Maine, and settled for a time in New York City. The remarkably warm reception of his art and ideas in America made the execution of his so-called Great Plan feel more imminent than ever. Finally, in 1923, the Roerichs arrived in India and prepared for their journey, which would take them to Chinese Turkestan, the Siberian Republic of Altai, Mongolia, and Tibet. Ultimately, Roerich never did find Shambhala, but he did achieve monumental things in addition to the 7,000-odd paintings he made during his lifetime. Among his most noble contributions is what's known as the Roerich Pact, a treaty for the preservation of precious heritage sites during times of conflict. In 1935, the pact was signed into law by the United States and 21 other nations. His efforts won him multiple nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize and praise from major figures such as Albert Einstein, a self-proclaimed militant pacifist who considered Roerich a genius. Accompanying the pact is Roerich's Banner of Peace, which bears 3 dots enveloped by a circle, a symbol found on artifacts across cultures and eras. Some interpret it as the eternal circle of culture enveloping art, science, and religion. Others as the past, present, and future of humanity secured within the circle of eternity. So we come full circle to the origins of this museum, which likewise vows to preserve and protect Roerich's legacy. Back in New York, the Roerichs had established both the Roerich Museum and the Master Institute of United Arts, an educational institution for music, art, design, linguistics, journalism, dance, the things that make us cultural creatures. The Master Institute attracted a number of notable artists, including George Bellows, Rockwell Kent, and Isamu Noguchi, but funding was cut when the Great Depression hit, and both the Institute and the original museum closed in the 30s. By this time, Roerich and his family had settled in India's Kulu Valley in the Himalayan foothills, where he died in 1947 at the age of 73. But his endeavors didn't die with him. In 1949, one of the Master Institute's founding members led the establishment of the Nicholas Roerich Museum here. Today, the museum is home to one of the most comprehensive collections of Nicholas Roerich's work, with over 200 paintings in its possession, and it's open to the public free of charge. I grew up in this neighborhood, so it's always a treat to be back. And speaking of treats, it just so happens that one of the Upper West Side's best bagel joints is just a block away from the museum. Absolute Bagels is a long-standing local favorite. The owner moved here in the 80s from his native Thailand, and his first New York bagel was a revelation. He apprenticed at various bagel shops around the city before he established his own in 1990. The Upper West Side is largely residential, but there's a lot of iconic stuff up here. On 112th and Broadway, you've got Tom's, aka the Seinfeld Diner, the famous Hungarian pastry shop between 110th and 111th in Amsterdam, and just across the street is the imposing St. John the Divine, one of the largest cathedrals in the world. But sometimes it's nice to just sit and enjoy a peaceful moment. It's no Shambhala, but a good bagel is pretty close to paradise.